what happens to form then when you write this way? And do you see a style that has evolved or over a period of time that you would call
It a form of the writing or form of the performance?
both, in the sense of how one influences the other?
Yeah.
So the writing, of course, you've spoken about how it's a journey through the rehearsal and the workshopping and the performance. So what do you see as a form that emerges, which is presented at the end?
So I think in the writing and partly in my style as a director, there is a considerable influence of the cinema, and I think that one of the things that really preoccupies me is how we experience the passage of time and how time acts as an element on bodies and relationships and spaces.
Right.
And I think that becomes an interesting element, and I feel like that's something that the cinema is extremely preoccupied with. So from a very sort of basic element like how does one scene transition into another, to how do characters kind of unveil themselves over time. I think that's a formal element that works its way into the writing.
Right.
And obviously there are ideas that we evolve over time. So one thing that strikes me in terms of Quicksand is there are some particular qualities to it, formal qualities, that we arrived at very early. The first two are qualities of the staging, which is that we decided in the beginning itself that we were going to stage it in the round with the audience around. So that kind of has particular demands of the actors and the action, but also the writing, because I'm not sure how successful this was at Rangashankara, because in Rangashankara we're essentially playing to a proscenium space with its kind of structures and acoustics, but playing in the round. But certainly in Delhi, the idea was that depending on your proximity and perspective from where you were sitting, you see the play in a different way.
Right.
And at times you hear things clearer than, say, somebody at the other end of the room. And that really influences how you feel about what's happening in the characters. So that was a very early decision. So then the script has to kind of support that.
Right.
The second was this idea that we wanted to place some kind of sense of doubt and uncertainty in the middle of the play. Because that's one quality to general discourse in the world right now, but especially on social media, that I find kind of almost in very short supply. I mean, you very rarely read a conversation or an argument or a sort of Twitter rant between two people where suddenly one person says, you know what, actually you're making sense, I have to reconsider my point. Or I don't know enough about this, let me find. That never happens. It's because mostly people talking at each other. Yeah. And arguments tend to then become extremely sort of polarized. And it's really not people trying to sort of engage with each other in a conversation, it's people trying to make a point. And that's one element of kind of performative dialogue that we had to kind of deal with even formally in the play. And so one of the decisions that we took, which we have in the past with other pieces of work, but influenced the writing a great deal, is David Mamet has this advice to writers, which is that try and begin a scene as late as you can and end it as early as you can. So, begin the scene after something has already happened and end it when there's the possibility of something happening, so that, at that level you leave your audience engaged. And we did that very actively with Quicksand, is that we wrote out scenes and wrote out stories, and then most scenes actually in the play begin after something has happened.
Right.
So the incident itself isn't really the focus of the play, it's the aftermath, or the ripples, as somebody was just saying. And I feel like that also influenced the writing a great deal, because how do you write giving the audience enough information about what's going on, but still leaving them in doubt about some things or curious about what's going to happen. And I think that in that the actors were great collaborators, because I would go into rehearsal with a draft of a scene, we would read it out, and then each of them had quite unique responses, and it would usually be like, but this is telling us this, and do we need to know this? Is that entire paragraph necessary? And that's a great kind of collaborative atmosphere to work with, because even if I decide to disagree or say that I have to justify why I'm keeping something. And I think this was interesting in Quicksand, is the actors till the last day, even after our first shows, in fact, one of them came up to me just minutes before the Ranga Shankara performance and said, in that scene I'm saying this, but doesn't it feel a bit facile because this has happened? So in that moment you have to clarify and say that, well, you could think of it this way, and then they go back. If they're convinced, they go back with it. If they're not convinced, they continue to struggle with it. And that happened a lot. This idea of clarifying motive, intention.
Right.
Even when you have doubt, the doubt has to be sort of structured in it can't be sort of fogginess. It can't be, I have no clue.
Yeah.
So, it has to be, I'm stuck in between 2, 3, 4 positions.
So in a sense, I think there is a certain kind of advantage to have both the artistic director and the writer rolled into one, and the process where the actors are also developing this work. So there's a lot of fluidity, I think, with and there's a lot of possibility, a potential for possibilities. So, but when do you decide as a writer, say, how do you decide that this is when this goes into the script and this stays? Is there a point where you make this decision and you wear different hats when you make these decisions? How does it happen?
I mean, as much as there are advantages to kind of working as a writer-director, there are also distinct disadvantages. And one of them is related to the question that you've just asked, which is that when does the writer kind of distance himself? In Quicksand, actually, because the writing process took too long, there was this overlapping presence, and it's not like I see myself in kind of sort of bipolar ways as a writer director, because it very much there are certain overlaps to it, particularly in the method that we work. But I found myself, when I went into rehearsal every day, very consciously distancing myself from the writing, because what happens is then the director has to go in and test the material.
Right.
And the material can only really be tested when it's played. And so at one level you have to give it time and be patient, and not feel like, oh, it doesn't work, rewrite. But at the same time you have to be like, it needs to be 3 minutes shorter. And so it's like instructions to self then. But I'm extremely reliant on collaborators here, not just the actors, but our production manager on this production, who's from Bangalore, Bharavi, was very, very involved. He would be in rehearsal every day, and he was staying with me as well. So post rehearsal we would chat, and he would say that, in this scene this is happening, and this is really a perspective from the outside. And every day he would position himself in different areas of the room. Our designers as well, our lighting designer would come in every now and then and see something and say that, from my perspective, this is what it feels like. I'm a bit confused about this scene. So I felt like the writer had to be engaged throughout the process usually. But I suppose for me, sometimes what the ideal thing is, when there is enough space from so the script is ready, and then you're taking a draft into rehearsal, and then the director is really just a director. And then if there are edits, then you have to sort of enable that. But here it wasn't ideal. I mean, I think eventually things happened and it worked, but it wasn't ideal that there were these many overlaps. Fortunately, after Quicksand is my 10th play that has been realized on stage. And I think by this time I'm less possessive and sentimental about the writing. So sometimes you think you've written what is a very effective or beautiful moment, and you go into rehearsal the next day, and the consensus is it should go. And initially, I remember I always found that aspect quite brutal, because you really sort of, and sometimes I don't have this very regimented, I wake up at 8 o'clock and write for 4 hours. I can't do that. Sometimes it takes me a week to write a scene. Sometimes it happens in the stretch of one night. I spend many sleepless nights just staring at a notebook or a computer screen. So in that scenario, sometimes you feel, because in that moment you felt like this moment or this kind of sequence of conversation really made sense to you. And then you take it into the space, and when actors are speaking it or just reading it, and then somebody feels, and sometimes it could be you also that feels that too much is being spoken, or too much is being said, or not enough is being said, then I think there's a bit of a pang for the writer, because something that you've been so sure about has been tested and failed.
Right.
I think I've become less kind of emotional about that. I think that, and there really the director has to make the call, particularly when you're writing, directing. I've been telling people, I've been claiming for years now that, this is the last play that I've written that I'm going to direct myself. I'm going to start, directing other people's work and give I don't know why it's something that doesn't happen. It's also because there are ideas that I get stuck into that I want to realize both physically and textually. And Quicksand was one of those ideas where I knew very much that I wanted to direct it. And I also wanted to work with a small cast and, really sort of sink my teeth into.
So you did mention how your training in film or television comes into this medium of theatre, and how it is kind of brought in this perspective of time and movement of time. What else has it done according to you? Like, what have you brought in from film in terms of learning or deconstruction of the medium of theatre that would have come in as a tool or a technique or a perspective?
So I studied film studies, so film theory and film aesthetics. I didn't actually do filmmaking, so most of my work was from a critical perspective.
Right.
And in my early professional career, I worked as a film programmer and a film academic. I mean, I was writing on film. And I worked almost, at one point, almost exclusively on Asian cinema, and particularly Southeast Asian, East Asian cinema. And there was a particular quality to films made, I think, in Southeast Asia, so the Philippines, Thailand, but also Taiwan, Korea, Japan, Indonesia. At this speed in the 2000s, and there was a great, particularly amongst what one would call the sort of art house or avant-garde filmmakers in these countries, there was a great investment in temporality, in how time passes. Something that may have been was a quality to say European cinema in the 60s and 70s with people like Antonioni and Bergman and many other filmmakers. And this is something that I found really, really fascinating. When I started making theatre, when we started working together around 10 years ago, there were certain things about theatre language that I wanted to test, or I wanted to kind of rethink. So at one level, very simply, something like how scenes change into each other. So the idea that a moment begins, ends, blackout, next moment begins, ends, is something that I found quite staid. I found that it allowed a switch to go off almost, and also because audiences at the period of time that we started making work weren't really sort of invested in theatre. It was a place that you go to, it's an evening out. And what you were saying when we began this conversation about there developing a new language, and I think actively a lot of theatre makers across the country, not just in urban centers but also in smaller towns and cities, and have been faced with that challenge. That in the age of multiplex cinema, how do you bring an audience into the theatre and make sure that they aren't kind of disconnected? And one way is to really reinvigorate the language and to break certain expectations. And so Quicksand as a production does something that many of my productions do, which is that there is really no blackout ever. And if it is, it's it's just a moment of darkness before something else happens. It's not a chapter marker, it's not that moment to breathe. And things transition to each other. So that this idea of the dissolve is very sort of cinematic, that one moment dissolves into another moment, and cinematically that's an idea that we've inherited from the